Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. Let me start by thanking the organizers for having me here today. Um, Post-lunch sessions are usually not the best ones to be talking on great powers or any other sort of power, but we'll try our best. Hopefully, um, uh, the issues that we raise will be interesting enough for you to keep awake and to then help us have an interesting conversation thereafter. I came very late to this project, so I'm still sort of trying to work out what to do with the theme. The theme that I've chosen to write on is, as I don't know if that's the title in the in the seminar list, but I'm sort of looking at Indo-US relations under the Modi government and trying to ask a simple question: what are the factors that are driving this trajectory at this particular point in time, and possibly focusing more on the issue of non-alignment as a conceptual category. So I think my submission would be a bit different from the other two submissions, which would perhaps be more about the sort of issues that we were discussing in the morning, as to whether, so what are the sort of empirical implications of a particular bilateral relationship. And how that pans out. So I think we have two very interesting submissions on South Asia and Indo-Pacific later on. But before that, let me sort of try to paint this broad picture for you as to where I'm coming from insofar as understanding this crucial relationship is concerned, and trying to sort of look at it more conceptually about some of the conceptual underpinnings of the last 2.5 years of Modi government's in office. It has been a reality since the end of the Cold War that we have seen Indo-US relations being transformed. The structural narrative that shaped Indo-US relations till then dramatically changed, and so we had a very different architecture of the relationship post the end of the Cold War. And all governments, irrespective of their political hues, irrespective of their ideological convictions, both in Delhi and Washington, have shaped this trajectory. So in India, where we have governments from Congress and the BJP, primarily the two main political parties in Washington, both the Republicans and the Democrats, have by now crafted a trajectory for a relationship that looks incredibly transformative today, that looks very, very different from the one that we were used to during the Cold War. So in that sense, this is a pan-partisan trend. This trend transcends party politics, both now in Delhi and Washington, Mr. Trump's victory notwithstanding. So I think that in itself tells you a very different story about Indo-US relationship in the last quarter of a half century than perhaps what we are used to. However, it is also important to go back to that phase of pre-May 2014. And to go back to the sort of despondency that had set in many other factors as well, but also in this particular realm of Indo-US relationship. And that is interesting because despite all that was going for Indo-US relationship and has been going on for Indo-US relationship, when we were looking at if we were to have this discussion, or if we have had this discussion, say in April, March 2014, the sense would be very different. As to where this relationship was going then. And the scenario looked very bleak. The US-India relationship was described as being stuck on a plateau. There was an argument about, on both sides of the equation, there were deep misgivings. Primarily, the Delhi side of the equation looked very wobbly. Partly because the structure of decision making was unclear, and partly because there was a sense of policy paralysis that was afflicting governance in almost every sphere. This foreign policy was no exception, and Indo-US relations in particular were no exception. So almost it was as if the bar was set too high by the US-India nuclear deal, and after that everything was coming down, was falling down, and there was a lot of despondency, especially in Washington, as to why Washington was investing so much in a relationship which was giving so few dividends. So therefore it is interesting when we now look at this relationship from this vantage point, that despite all that had gone for that relationship, in April, May 2014, the relationship looked very, very different. It looked very difficult. There was a sense of the sense that it was adrift, that no one was in command, and also the prognosis was very difficult. There was an argument that yes, it was looking as if Mr. Modi would come to power, but so what? The argument was that he comes with his own historical baggage. He comes with his own issues with the US, and so even if he came to power, the argument went, it would necessarily mean that Indo-US relations would sort of transcend some of the problems that they were encountering then. So it was a very interesting inflection point, which we were witnessing not only the decay of the old order and an emergence of a new order in India, but an order that in India was generating a lot of excitement. In Washington, it was generating a concern that even if Mr. Modi comes to office, and Modi government comes to office, it's not necessarily that things would become very well. It was not necessarily that things would go down to the level of excitement that this relationship generated, partly because of the historical problems that Indo-US relations, partly because of the historical relationship between Mr. Modi and the US, and even in India. It is very interesting to go back to some of those writings. Some of Mr. Modi's closest advisors at that point in time were advising him in their public writings, oh, don't go to the US. They should be treated with a distance. Mr. Modi would be well advised to reach out to other countries who have been more welcoming to him, and therefore perhaps a new foreign policy was in the offing. So that was the larger sense, that was the larger environment in which the Modi government came to office. So against that backdrop, if you look at the transformation in Indo-US relations in the last 2.5 years, it's a very different place today. I mean, observers of this relationship are calling it an extraordinarily good place to be in as the relationship stands today. And this transformation is something that I'm interested in as an analyst, to understand what are the factors that are driving it conceptually, what has driven this transformation. Because if you look at critical problems from civil nuclear liability to defense transformation, if you look at global context in which Indo-US ties have been problematic on global issues, trade and environment, if you look at regional issues like Pakistan, excuse me, and if you look at the larger strategic context, the Indo-Pacific, on all those issues, we have seen a remarkable change, a remarkable transformation, and a remarkable shift from both sides. And in particular, insofar as Modi government has moved ahead and tried to sort some of these critical issues out and tried to articulate a new position for India on some of these key critical issues. So, it's that transformation that I would like to investigate a bit more. And like all good social science explanations, one can locate an argument at multiple levels of analysis. So at the individual level, you have Mr. Modi's own beliefs and inclinations. And this is perhaps very important to consider in the Indian context, where prime ministers have wielded enormous power on foreign policy, and Mr. Modi in particular wants to shape Indian foreign policy in a certain way. So therefore, his beliefs and ideological inclinations become very important, very interesting, and very pertinent to where the way trajectory has been shaping up. So for Modi's vision of India's radical transformation, the US remains essential. From Make in India to Digital India, the success of Mr. Modi's many ambitious plans for economic transformation hinge upon greater cooperation with the US. As he himself has written, both US and India have fundamental stakes in each other's success, and more so for New Delhi, which seeks to radically transform into a developed economy. Now in this, Mr. Modi is no different from his predecessors. All Indian decision makers since 1991 have shown an understanding of how critically important the US is for India. The difference, however, lies in the fact that Mr. Modi has been able to openly acknowledge somewhat of a bandwagoning behavior and has no qualms about it. Open ideological commitment by the Modi government to Indo-US relationship is perhaps one of the most dramatic changes in the bilateral relationship. We can couch this in whatever we want, but I think this is the radical transformation that has, that one is looking at in terms of just the articulation of the issue. Now, this is at the individual level, shaping Mr. Modi or his priorities. But at an institutional level, something else has happened, whereas we are looking at an institutional argument for why this has happened. And the institutional argument is also predicated upon the authority of the Prime Minister and on how he wields that power in a parliamentary setup like India. So, what we are looking at today is a situation where no Indian Prime Minister except Modi since 1989 has enjoyed such an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha. Even though foreign policy has always been Prime Minister's domain in India, power equations in Parliament have had a significant influence on the conduct of foreign policy. A weak Prime Minister with low numbers in the Parliament is subject to various pulls and pressures exerted by colleagues, party allies, and also by the parliamentary opposition. Individual conviction, therefore, gets tempered by the parliamentary authority, most vividly captured by the plight of Dr. Manmohan Singh, who, despite his conviction about where he wanted to take Indo-US relationship, he could not, because the way his authority was structured, with the way the parliament was structured, and with the way he was hobbled in doing what he wanted perhaps to do. Given Mr. Modi's unique position today, he can be counted upon among a few prime ministers like Jawaharlal Nehru or Indira Gandhi, who have enjoyed absolute command over foreign policy matters. Now, this, of course, is linked to the larger structural argument that I talked about at the very beginning in terms of the end of the Cold War and how that has shaped up. But even if you are looking at the structural argument in more recent times, the most prominent structural variable in shaping in Indo-US relations is what is happening around India, the rise of China and all it means for Indian foreign policy, and in particular what we have seen in the last couple of years, this growing entrenchment of Pakistani and Chinese interests. Now, for a long time, Indian decision makers have been cognizant of the threat posed by China, but in recent years, the Sino-Indian equation, the most disconcerting development in this realm has been Beijing's policy of using Pakistan with greater vehemence than ever before. So this is again a new development in some ways, because we have seen a tempering of that over the last couple of decades, but suddenly we see excuse me, that element ramping up again. So in the past, Indian governments have tried to manage this challenge posed by Beijing through both bilateral cooperation and dialogue, hoping that China would be persuaded to dispose itself more positively to India. This is something that came across in the last session as well, as to what are the realms of cooperation and conflict between Sino-Indian relations. This is one thing which the Modi government also attempted. So you can go back to the early phase of the Modi government, where you do see an attempt to reach out to China, an attempt to make a case that a new government has come to power, and so there is a new willingness to resolve old disputes. However, success eluded him, and we are at a position now where, or at least very soon, we enter into a realm where conflict, or at least the idea that the national interests of the two countries are diverging more rapidly than perhaps at any point in recent memory came out very openly. Mr. Modi has openly stressed the need for China to reconsider its approach, so as to that is holding the Sino-Indian relations back from realizing their full potential. He has also openly talked about China's use of Pakistan as a proxy in South Asia. Now, this is again a shift in the way Indian positions have been articulated in the past. Therefore, in many ways, managing China's growing military capability and the threat that it poses, the argument goes that external balancing is one of the most important variables that India has to consider, and therefore one can look at it more structurally, the embrace of the US as part of that dynamic. Lastly, I would just point out, I think, an important variable which perhaps many of us don't talk about, and which perhaps is going to be the centerpiece of my argument, is the ideological one. So we have looked at the personal, the institutional, the structural. Then comes, in my opinion, an argument which is largely about the direction or the broader focus of Indian foreign policy, and that is where, which is this ideological element is underscored by a move away from the rhetoric as well as the practical aspects of non-alignment. And this is important because I think we don't often consider non-alignment is built into the system so much that we often take this as a as a starting point of any discussion. As late as 2012, we often forget the creme de la creme of Indian strategic community was talking of non-alignment 2.0. Being the framework through which Indian foreign policy should navigate its foreign policy priorities. And it was a foreign policy option for a balancing power. Now, what we have seen in the last 2.5 years is a different articulation of Indian foreign policy priorities. So for Modi government has shifted this discourse from being a balancing power to a leading power. And that in itself makes fundamental changes in the way that India then reacts to its neighbors and in the way India shapes its foreign policy priorities. Because the moment you start saying India is a leading power, it means that the basis on which you are relating to your friends as well as to your adversaries, that changes. And I think that has brought about a fundamental rearticulation of India, not simply vis-a-vis the US, but also vis-a-vis China, something that we discussed in the last session. So this has in many ways heralded a new foreign policy dynamic whereby robust Indo-US ties are viewed as important to enhance India's strategic autonomy. Again, contra to the earlier notion of a strategic autonomy, whereby any attempt to get close to the US would be deemed as unacceptable because that would constrain your strategic autonomy. Now the argument goes is that the more you go get closer to the US, the better your chances become of dealing with other friends, even the better your chances become of dealing with your adversaries. And I think that is something that is new, and that is something that is a rearticulation of Indian foreign policy priorities, and that is something that will continue to shape Indo-US relations as well as India's relations with its other key actors. So the foreign policy seems to be predicated on the belief that rather than proclaiming non-alignment as an end in itself, India needs deeper engagement with its friends and partners if it is to develop leverage in its dealing with its adversaries and competitors. Now, this rethink on non-alignment is also important to understand the Modi government's approach to the US and larger foreign policy as well. But since this is the paper on Indo-US relations, I would say that this, along with the institutional, individual, structural variables, the ideological variable, which often does not get as much emphasis in terms of the way we project or in the way we try to analyze the changing trajectory in the last 2.5 years, it is important to understand because this is the first center-right government in India that is changing the approach, not only its approach, but I think at a fundamental level, India's approach to the world by articulating the need for India to be seen as a leading power, and by that it means by doing that, it is also transforming the basis of its engagement with all the great powers, including the US. Thank you.